The year is 1999. The coolest things in town are bleached ramen hair, pocket-sized guilt, and Game Boy I can't believe it's still not color. And then Star Wars Episode 1 comes out and everyone loses their collective mind. Even if the movie as a whole left a bit to be desired, the roughly 10 minutes of pod racing scenes was, and still is, a hallmark of cinema and would forever inspire fans. This is Gamey Builds, and today we're gonna make a pod racer out of household junk. Let's just get something out of the way because if you're wondering, yes, I was heavily inspired by other Scratch modelers here on YouTube, especially these guys here, so shoutouts to them and a big thank you for letting me peek over their shoulders and copy their homework. So for this pod racer, I'm not aiming for the fastest, sleekest ship in the galaxy, nor something that could complete an infamous space route in a unit of distance rather than a unit of time, but more likely something that would make someone say,
"What a piece of junk!"
A line which I've always found funny, given that this particular character was up until this point only seen driving this bucket of bolts, which I'm pretty sure my pod racer could take on at the Mos Espa track any day. So I started with research, referencing these extremely cool and detailed Star Wars cutaway diagrams that I used to spend hours staring at Borders when I was a little kid. I also referenced images from a ton of airplane jet turbines, then began collecting an unnecessary amount of round, vaguely cylindrical things. I say unnecessary because there was no way I was going to use all of this stuff, but since I wasn't exactly sure what the base of the engines would be, I dumped everything on my desk and tried fitting stuff together, trying to get a feel for the shapes that would work and eventually become the engines, or the pods.
Is that the pod in Pod Racer, or is the cockpit the pod?
I settled on this pair of bottles from the local dollar store, then immediately destroyed them with my Dremel. And yes, in case you're wondering, this tool is ancient. I actually found it under our house in a dusty box recently. But hey, it's an older tool, but it checks out. The window cutaways in the bottles were then screened off from the inside, a task which proved surprisingly challenging, as the metal grating, which comes from an old grease screen, clearly had better things to do with its afternoon than become one with my pod racer. And so, I had to resort to force. I also disassembled a couple of these lighters with the purpose of scavenging the interesting looking bits inside. Also, this was terrifying. Make sure if you do this, and especially if you prefer keeping your eyebrows, you're away from open flames. I next jumped straight into adding details on the engines, first using this old piece of cardstock cut into thin strips. You can purchase this stuff online, of course, but I prefer just never throwing away cereal boxes in old packaging. Some people call it hoarding like a crazy person, but I just call it making a perfect nest for me and my 29 cats. The thin bits of cardstock were then used to add some dimension to the plastic bottles, including these window dressings for these screen holes. Also, lots of trapezoids, because nothing says Star Wars ships like a quadrilateral with only one pair of parallel sides. To give the engines a bit more dimension and personality, I wanted to add some giant wings. For this, I used a cut-up cover of an old hardcover book. You can find these for free on Craigslist, and oftentimes garage sales will have a free books box. And even if there's originally a price tag on these items, I find that if you bring along your cutting tools and explain how you're going to slice and dice the books up into small pieces when you get home, it can usually lead to some impressive discounts. To help with the effect of these fins, I also sanded down the edges with my Dremel. I knew I wanted plenty of pipes, wires, and tubes snaking around my engines, so I drilled a few holes and got to it. The wires here are from a cheap USB cable, also $1 at the dollar store. These gold metal bits are from binder clips I found at Daiso. Another kind of wire effect was achieved by bending and gluing down this guitar string. This technique was stolen from Boylai Hobby, mentioned earlier. I like the texture, but in all honesty, I find this wire a little too rigid to work with comfortably in cramped spaces like these engines, and I actually prefer standard electrical wire. While we're on the topic, here's a technique of my own invention for making ridged cables, a paperclip wound with electrical wire. You can do this by hand, of course, but a drill gets it done a lot faster. And here's the finished engines. Well, sort of. Up until this point, I was racking my brains for a way to achieve this, a spiraling turbine effect. The circular things are very tough to do by hand, and even more so if it requires the kind of precision seen here. But fortunately, a browse through a nearby thrift store led me to this gem, an old RC toy with hubcaps that were of perfect shape and size. I lifted those hubcaps straight out of Compton and repurposed them for my Podracer's turbines. Don't worry, the Space Police will never know after a fresh coat of paint. Another great source of cardstock is old tissue boxes. This one got mauled into flaps used to cover the unsightly sides of the turbines. For added detail, I glued down some wooden parts from miniature clothespins. In retrospect though, I kind of regret this decision, as the final product still looks like clothespins even after painting and weathering. I think one of the keys to successful scratch building is to be as transformative as possible with the items used. These cool looking grating things came from a hacked up plastic hair curler. I actually had set these aside prior to realizing that another scratch builder did the exact same thing for his Podracer model, which you should definitely check out in the links in the description of this video. I felt that the grating would be a bit too plain by itself though, so I added some small details with a desecrated USB cable and some old marker caps. Also, may have failed to mention that I have an impressive midichlorian count, which allowed me to force duplicate this single grating into a second one. Riveting. Speaking of which, one thing that all those flat, plain metal panels could really use is some rivets. I'm making my own with a leather punch on its smallest setting. I recently got a great deal on this LED tube lighting on eBay. While it's not as bright as I'd hoped, I think it'll do nicely for the binding between the two engines. If you're not clear on what bindings are, it's that thing that did what we all wanted to do when watching episode 1. Going back to the gratings, I went ahead and sprayed these since there's no way I'd be able to get full paint coverage once they're inside the engines, and then I put them inside the engines. This ended up being a colossal pain, as was getting all the wiring to fit and hoping furiously that none of the wires would come loose, thus rendering a bunch of my efforts here futile. Working on the rear thrusters, I'm using superglue caps here. Don't worry, the superglue itself has already been used up, or you could say exhausted. I also decided at this point that I wanted some of those metal fin flap things on the back of the engines. This is a classic Podracer engine look. I'm not exactly sure what the technical term for these pieces are, but I'm sure I'll find the answer in the comments. To tie those pieces into the rest of the engine's body, I glued down a thin strip of cardstock. And now it was time to work on the cockpit. I'm pretty sure this is the pod of pod racing. And hey, remember those lighters that I dangerously disassembled earlier? Well, instead of using them to Mustafar my face, I thought they'd make pretty great tank electrical component saddlebag things for the pod. And yes, that is a Tic-Tac container. Because the pilot isn't an actual Tic-Tac, I needed a way to set him inside the pod. So I traced out a rough shape and then went adrenaline. Unfortunately though, after gluing it all together, I realized the container wasn't exactly symmetrical, so I rebuilt it using cardstock. This is all a part of scratch building. Sometimes you have to try a few different things to find what works. Let's add some pedals and runners and stuff, and once the basic shape is complete, I detail. Now it was time to figure out how to route the wiring through this thing. A better builder would have definitely considered this much earlier in the process, but a better builder I am not. In the end, I opted for the easiest method, which was just winding the wires around the tubes connecting the pod to the engines. I then snaked those wires through the back of the lighter and into the back of the Podracer. I did the same thing on the other side with other wires, but these are just there for symmetry and have no other function. It was now time to coat all of the cardstock and paper parts in Mod Podge. This gives the primer something to stick to while also protecting the papery bits and keeping them from acting like sponges when painted. Now comes my favorite part, priming the model for paint. Let me just grab my mask right quick because it's not like I've worn enough of these things in the last 2 years.
Help me take this mask off.
But you'll die.
Wise words, Luke, wise words indeed. I'm a man on a budget, so for primer I'm just using regular old cheap acrylic gray matte paint with a bunch of water. I've experimented a lot using other types of thinners and flow improvers, but honestly, water works pretty good for me most of the time. Once she was primed and ready to go, I strutted for the camera a bit and then got right down to business. I'm starting with a base coat of dark green, but just painting some parts of the Podracer. I want most of it to have an old metallic jet engine look. I touched up my paint job with a bit more of a lighter green, applied by brush. For a secondary color, a mustard yellow. Some fine detail with a smaller brush. While I've got the yellow out, let's add a touch of color to the engine greeblies. Some orange and red to round out our palette. Incidentally, I also purchased some Vallejo washes to add colors to the recessed parts of the model, but honestly I wasn't terribly impressed with the results. Perhaps I'm using the wrong brush or the material I'm painting onto isn't correct. Once again, I turn to the inevitable answer to this inquiry in the all-knowing oracle that is the comments section. Once the washes were down, I added a bit of weathering to the green metal with a lighter green color sponged into place. Here's another favorite step of mine, metal mode. Just a touch of silver paint here and there suddenly gives the illusion that this isn't just some cobbled together plastic junk, but high-end cobbled together metal junk. It was at this point that I wanted to add a bit more depth to the colors, so I did some spot touch-ups with my airbrush. I'm adding a watered down black here to make the crevice parts seem more crevicey. Next up, these metallic blue and red paints were used to make those turbines extra hot and spicy. While we're at it, why not add a touch of orange to the bits around the binders? We'll use this to fool the eye and make the glow from them seem a bit brighter, I hope. Some basic painting effects were then added to the pod. Yes, at this point I have looked it up, the pod is this part right here. Now I can win the next nerd conversation I have about this. Hooray for me. I decided this was a good time to begin work on the Podracer pilot. I made an armature out of paper clips and electrical wire, then I threw on some Sculpey, like Palpy throwing Windu out the windy window. I decided that I wanted the rider to be Rodian, which is not only the race of the terribly inefficient bounty hunter sent to capture Solo, but also the race of one of Anakin's childhood friends. I like to think that maybe he grew up and followed in his buddy's footsteps of pod racing, and then stopped there. After getting baked in the hot Tatooine suns at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 14 minutes, I was mildly annoyed to find that his arms had moved and his position was no longer correct. So, like the majority of posters on social media who find they don't fit their surroundings, I turned to some reconstructive surgery. Once this unrealistic standard for perfection was reached, I gave him a big hand, and then a second one. And then some clothes. This was a pretty straightforward process of flattening Sculpey to make long strips of clay to wrap around each of the appendages. After he was family friendly, I added details like wrinkles and folds with a plastic clay knife. And after that nip and tuck, it was back into the oven for him. Predictably, he still didn't quite fit right in his seat, so I shaved off a bit more of both him and the pod to get that picture-perfect fit. After making some slight structural changes to the pod to accommodate my oversized pilot, I did a bit of repainting. And once I was sure he was ready, I painted the pilot himself. I started with a black primer to help with shading him later on. Then he got a beautiful coat of a lovely Rodian green for his skin, a color that I hear it is not easy being. For his pilot's jacket, a dark red because it was available. And blue for the eyes with highlights. Is it just me, or is this one handsome alien? Like maybe the actual competition he's in isn't about the pod racer at all, but rather that of a young female Rodian's heart. For the base, this is a simple construction of foam core surrounded on all sides by 1mm cardstock, also called chipboard. I'm using these foam blocks glued down and then carved up into the rough shape of sand dunes. Once I had my basic shape set, I coated it all in a mixture of Mod Podge, paint, and sand. And if you're watching this, Rachel, thanks for the sand. Unlike Anakin, I'm a big fan of this stuff, even if, admittedly, it does get everywhere. I also thought it would be cool to model some dust clouds brought to you courtesy of these cotton balls. And that's it. Time to take a deep breath and see the finished product. So all in all, I'm happy with this model. This is my 4th scratch build. There were a lot of new techniques attempted here, and I would say that most were successful, with the exceptions I've mentioned, like using the clothespins, using that Vallejo wash. That was probably my error, but I think I could have come up with a better option for that. I also wish I'd used LED filament rather than the tube lighting that I bought. I think it would have been a lot brighter, but overall I can't complain too much. I enjoyed this build, and I hope you did too. So until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.